Good morning, students. In the previous chapter of Three Orders, we saw how the European society was evolving from the 10th century onwards, how they started as hunter gatherers, and as the complexity in society kept increasing, their standard and their status and the method of living also started changing. They started getting into manorial states. From manorial states, even that kind of arrangement became complex. Then they started having knights and started having regular armies because the urbanization had started happening and people were getting wealthy around. A lot of people started now getting into trading. A lot of people from the younger population from the manorial states started moving towards the towns. They wanted to live and settle there rather than spending their time cultivating the fields in extremely harsh conditions. So all that was changing, and this chapter that is changing cultural traditions is just an extension of the development and the evolution that we discussed in our previous chapter, that is the three orders. So let's start. From the 14th to the end of the 17th century, towns were growing in many countries of Europe. A distinct urban culture also developed. Townspeople began to think of themselves as more civilized than rural people. Like we even in India, it's the same thing that we say, "Ah, wo dehati hai." The way people who do not kind of, or the population or certain set of people who would not be probably living the same kind of life that we live. And it has nothing to do with economy, those kind of the people we address as society, the society is addressing as dehati. They might be having much more money than probably you and I can ever think of. That guy might be having 100 acres of land under him, or probably, who knows, 300 acres, 400 acres, and we live in probably 1500 square feet or 2000 square feet, and we feel that yes, we have arrived in the society. But then this was the same thing which was happening in Europe, just because they lived and acted in a certain sort of way. You do not expect, in the rural areas, and even at that point in time in Europe, their people would be probably having humble and modest pastimes, and people in towns probably we would be going to cafeteria and malls and theaters. And when naturally someone from the rural part of India comes, and we think that अरे ये क्या है, देहाती लोग आ गए, and that kind of stuff. Because he doesn't know how to dress the way you do. He doesn't know how to eat with fork and spoon, and definitely not with chopsticks. So you can understand that. So it was the same situation which was happening in the 14th and 15th and 16th century Europe, where there was and now started emerging a rural and an urban divide, something which did not exist till 13th century, because everything was rural. Everyone was into farming. Everyone was living in manorial states. People were primarily into farming. So there was no rural and urban divide, because there were no towns to speak of. So there was no urban life at all. But it was only after 14th century that the rural and urban divide started to happen, and in the European countries and the continent of Europe. Now, townspeople began to think of themselves as more civilized than the rural people. Towns, particularly Florence, Venice, and Rome, became centers of art and learning. Students, the map that you would see here, this is a very important map, and remember this. Here Florence, here it is Florence. This is a very, very important town. This essentially, this whole triangle explains and talks to you about the great Roman civilization and the great achievements of Italy, and of course the Roman civilization, that is Genoa, Venice, and Florence. And of course, you have the Rome here, but Rome was mainly a political capital. But then these were the places which were the centers of trade. They were the places which were the center of art, Renaissance, and these are some of the, not just some of the most important centers, yeah, for Italy, but they are the most important centers for the whole of Europe at that point in time, because you have to understand these were the ports which were Now, Florence is certainly not a port, but Genoa, Venice, these were the ports which were open to the warm water. Now, the countries like in the societies of Norway or Sweden or Denmark or Germany, they would never be able to boast such ports, and even England for that matter, because all of them used to live much north, and their waters were very, very cold and extremely chilly waters, which would be most of the times they would be frozen, many of their ports. So these were warm waters which used to attract and invite traders and ships from across the distant lands who would come here to trade. Okay, so these were very important centers, and we would see further how important they were. Now, there is a vast amount of material on European history from the 14th century: documents, printed books, paintings, sculptures, buildings, textiles. Much of this has been carefully preserved in archives, art galleries, and museums in Europe and America. From the 19th century, historians used the term Renaissance, literally rebirth, that's in English, to describe the cultural changes of this period. The historians who emphasized this most was a Swiss scholar, Jacob Burckhardt of the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was a student of the German historian Leopold von Ranke. Ranke had taught him that the primary concern of the historian was to write about states and politics using papers and files of government departments. Burckhardt was dissatisfied with this very limited goals that his master had set out for him. To him, politics was not just all the end in history writing. History was as much concerned with culture as with politics. In 1860, he wrote the book called The Civilization of Renaissance in Italy, in which he called his readers' attention to literature, architecture, and painting to tell the story of how a new humanist culture had flowered in Italian towns from the 14th to the 17th century. This is essentially talking about the fact that even in the early civilizations in Europe and uh, history was considered to be, politics was considered to be just moving, revolving, and rotating about the royal families and the kings and the queens, and essentially even that's how the history moved around. So naturally, the politics also moved around the same set of people: the nobility, the aristocracy, the rulers, and the relationships between different rulers, different kings, different queens, and that's what history and politics meant at that point in time. But for the first time, that Jacob Burckhardt disagreed, and he realized that people had also started becoming important here. It was not just that about the relationship between the rulers that was determining the course of politics in history, but it was also the basic interaction between the normal and the common people as well. The kind of culture, different cultures, which is and India is a very good example of it, because for hundreds and thousands of years, India was essentially about Hindu dharma or Sanatan dharma or the Aryan way of life. And suddenly by 11th century, we had Islamic invaders and travelers and the rulers and the conquerors who started entering from the Afghanistan side, who were Turkish, the Afghans, all of them started entering India. And how were they different? Their basic they left a unique mark on India, primarily because of the reason that their culture was different, their gods were different, their way of life was different, their thinking was different. And it was not just about that the thinking of the rulers was different, guys. Even the soldiers, they were the soldiers, they considered themselves to be the soldiers of Allah and that kind of stuff. And in India, we had a completely different outlook to life when it came even to common people. It was not that just the kings used to be benevolent, and you had great rulers, and the normal people were probably corrupt and all of that. No, Indians in general welcomed people from different faiths and cultures. We, in general, were non-violent. It was not that our kings were non-violent and we were butchers and killers. No, because our culture was different, our civilization was different, and that is what the European scholars now, by 18th and 19th century, they started realizing that for centuries their history and politics had been revolving and rotating around the interaction between different kingdoms, different empires, different rulers, kings, queens, nobility, aristocracy. But now it had to change, because now the people had started asserting themselves. And you have to understand, students, something which you have studied even in class 9 and 10, that uh, that in 1789 the French Revolution was a huge event. It was a huge event, not just in terms of the fact that, yes, people rose in revolt, realized their rights, and got rid of the ruler who ruled over them, that is Louis XVI. It was not just that way. It was for the first time. There were lots and lots of firsts which were there in the French Revolution. And it did not have an effect only in and within the French society. That is something which you need to understand. It had an effect. It had a tsunami effect. It had an effect across Europe. It had an effect which crossed Atlantic, entered America. It had effect into all parts of the world. And whereby people suddenly became important, not just in terms of that, yes, you need to give them representation, in terms of they should have the right to vote. No, it didn't just stop there. It went into so many other facets of life, whether it was political life, whether it was administrative life, whether it was military life. Everywhere, in every facet of life, trading, commerce, banking, everywhere. We should continue. Thank you.